All right. Good morning, everybody. We are here. We're back for day 2 of WordCamp Kent. We're so excited to have you guys back. I hope everyone listened into the community panel this morning. That was really inspirational and informational. A lot of good info. So we are here with Nathan Ingram to kick off our business and development track today. Nathan Ingram has been a freelance web developer since 1995. Currently, he is the host at iThemes Training, where he teaches WordPress and freelance business development topics via live webinar. He is also the host of the WP Business podcast, which offers news, tools, and insights for people who build websites for clients using WordPress. So, Nathan, welcome and take it away.
Well, good morning, everybody. Great to be back with you today. I had some technical problems yesterday, and I apologize for that. I'm going to put a link up in a minute that has a place where you can download the slides if you were in yesterday's presentation. They got cut short by issues on my end. Nobody else's fault. It was me. But it's great to be with you today. We're going to be talking about preventing client problems before they happen. So if you work with clients, chances are you run into problems, and we're going to talk about some things that can help you head those issues off before they even become an issue. I am from Birmingham, Alabama, and as Amanda mentioned, I'm the host at iThemes Training. I'm also here as an ambassador for Liquid Web and Nexus. Appreciate them allowing me to be a part of this event. Here's the link to download those slides and resources, nathaningram.com/WordCampKent. And if you want to connect with me after, if we run out of time for Q&A, you can connect with me there at nathaningram.com or at Nathan Ingram on Twitter. Happy to chat with you on any questions you might have coming out of today. I'm a growth coach for WordPress business owners. I love to help people solve the issues that tend to get in the way of growing your business as you are working with clients. So here's where we're going to be heading over the next 40 minutes or so. These are, in my experience, after having worked as a growth coach with WordPress business owners across the world in lots of different countries, hundreds of conversations over the last almost 7 years of doing that. These are the 9 most common problems that not only I face in my agency work, but also I see other people facing as well. We're going to talk about what happens when you're stalled on content, how to deal with an angry client, what happens when you have differing expectations, what happens if your clients disappear in the middle of a project, what happens when your attitude might get in the way, or if you have too much work. We're going to talk about scope creep, time wasters, and wrap it up with what I call the hero syndrome. So we have a long way to go in a short amount of time, and I'm looking forward to this because I think likely if you are a pretty typical person working with clients doing WordPress stuff, several of these you may even be experiencing today, and I think many of them will land with you and then they'll resonate. So again, the downloads are right there on the screen. You want to take a snap of the screen there, nathaningram.com/WordCampKent. You can download the slides and all the resources from today and yesterday as well. So let's get started on the first common problem that I see as we start to work with clients, and that's what happens when you get stalled on content. Now, when I do this talk live in a room full of people, online is great, live is better. It's great to look into faces and see this issue because I'll usually ask, okay, how many of you today are stalled on content with a project? And like half the room, the hands will go up because this is such a common problem. Now, we talked about this a little bit yesterday in Mastering the Client Consultation, but the reason that this happens and we get stalled on content is that the client just doesn't know where to start. Like the client, they're good at their business, but they're not necessarily a content expert. And quite frankly, even the ones who are, and maybe their business is in some way related to content, it's different writing something for someone else versus writing something about yourself. And so they tend to freeze up. Maybe they don't know where to start. It can also be a factor of the client is busy, and this is hard work. Like it's hard to start to generate the content for your website and start to think through a lot of those questions like we talked about yesterday. If you were in that talk, when you start asking questions about, okay, what does your business do? Who do you serve? Why should your customers choose you instead of a competitor? It can send the client into like this existential spiral, and it's a whole lot easier just to do some other work and push the content work off. So that happens a lot when we're working with clients. And the clients, as a result, we're stalled on content. I think the current record for the longest stalled on content goes to Melanie Adcock, a friend of mine in the Atlanta, Georgia area, who had a project that was stalled for 4 years waiting on the content 4 years. That's pretty crazy. So hopefully you don't have anything stalled that bad, but it's easy to get frustrated at clients like this. And I just it's helpful to just to relate to clients in the situation, because if you've ever tried to develop your own website or rebuild your own website, how long has it taken you to actually generate your own content about your services and your website? It's hard to do, and we're supposed to be the professionals at this. So I try to have a little bit of empathy for the client when this happens. But here's how to prevent it. So years ago, I started using a strategy that is called content first. And different people use that term and mean kind of different things. But for me, what content first means is that the very first thing we do on any project in our system, we do every project for every client the same way every time. There's a system that we run every project through, and it always starts with the content. Because in the past, if you did like I used to do, what I always used to do was, okay, the client has sent me the text for the About Us page. Okay, let's go build that. Oh, now we got a picture that's come in several days later. Let's go in and build that. And when you build a project piecemeal, it ends up taking you way longer. So what we do is we help the client generate all the content first. And when the content is generated, and that's the text, all the graphics, all the assets, everything they need for the site, when all of that stuff is complete, then we take that up and we start to actually build the website. It's a much more efficient process. And to help the client along with that process, we usually create what I call a content guide, which sounds really fancy, but really all it is a long list of questions. So here's, for example, our About Us page. And I ask the client proactive questions to help him or her get into that content. You know, what does your business do? What is it that when were you founded? Why did you start the business? Who is your ideal client? You start to ask these sorts of questions. What is your mission and vision? That help them think through that content so they don't get the white page syndrome and they just get stuck trying to create content from a blank page. Clients generally, I mean, they're not experts on this stuff, so we kind of have to help them along. Now, if that doesn't help, what I'll often do is approach the client with an interview. And so this is usually in addition to the cost of the project, and we'll spend a few hours with them actually helping them think through the content guide. And it's something where I or a writer that I work with will sit down with the client and actually ask the same questions in the content guide in an interview fashion, record that, and just begin to record in text the answers to the client that the client gives to those questions, and use that to then help the client generate the content for the page. So maybe you have skills to do that. Maybe you've got the ability to write. Maybe you don't. If you don't, then partner with a writer. There's lots of great writers out there, some likely in your local area, that maybe they're not the best at building websites, but they love to write. And there's a couple of different writers that I work with to do just this exact thing. And so one thing that I learned a long time ago is whenever, like, getting stalled on content is a problem in my process. So whenever you find a problem in your process of working with clients, it's an opportunity to offer a service to solve the problem. And so the service that we offer is professional content generation. And that can look at several different ways, like we just talked about. So getting stalled on content is very common. Help the client through it with a content guide, or partner with a writer and do it interview style. So the second problem that oftentimes we see as we work with clients is the angry client. Now, if you've ever dealt with an angry client, it is, it's not a lot of fun, right? Angry clients can really ruin your day. And it tends to happen for a couple of reasons. Maybe it's your fault. You do something up. You've done something that is really creating an issue between you and the client and their website or whatever. Or it could just be that the client is being unreasonable. And, they're wanting you to do some things that are outside the scope of work, or, their expectations are just, they're not even, they're not reasonable at all. So it could be one of those two things. And let's talk about each of those scenarios and how to respond to an angry client. Now, if the reason the client is angry is that it's your fault, like you've done something that has screwed something up. I was coaching a WordPress business owner through a situation where she actually made some DNS changes for the client and didn't realize there was email involved. And oh my goodness, the email was down for almost a full day before all those DNS changes got put back. And oh boy, what do we do in that situation when we've really done something that's created a problem for the client? Now, if you make a mistake, everybody makes mistakes. That's just life. When you make a mistake, it's really what you do next that really matters. Because when I've made mistakes working with clients, even clients that have gotten angry about it, you really have the opportunity to completely destroy or rescue the relationship with the client. You can earn the trust of a client after a bad situation almost in a better way than you can by never having made a mistake to begin with. It's what you do next that really matters. So my advice is always, look, if you made a mistake, apologize and be humble. Apologize and be humble. Empathize with the client. Verbalize the issue from the client's perspective. This is a really important skill to learn. And it sounds something like this. Mr. Client, Mrs. Client, I realize that we made a mistake here, and that must have caused these problems. And just try to explain the issue from the client's perspective of what you know they must have experienced from the problem that was created. Now, it's on us. It's our mistake. We're going to fix it. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the next steps. Here's what you can expect. And here's when you'll hear from me again. If you take the conversation in that context, you can actually earn a more loyal client to you after having screwed up than they even were before. Apologize and be humble. It goes a long, long way. Now, the most important thing here is don't get defensive if the client gets upset. If the client is mad at you, don't get defensive. There's an old proverb that says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And it's absolutely true. Don't get defensive. Don't try to start justifying, rationalizing, all those things. It's Stephen Covey's first of the 7 habits. Seek first to understand, then be understood. A lot of times if the client is angry with us, then we'll start to argue back with the client. And arguing with an angry client is like pouring gasoline on the fire. Don't get defensive. Look, just try to understand what's going on from the client's perspective. Listen to what the client has to say, and then respond. It's so very important. Now, here's something that I've learned as I've worked with web developers and myself having worked with clients for 25 years, but having had hundreds of conversations with WordPress business owners, what I've learned is that many of us who work in this space, we're really good with the details. We're detail-oriented people. We're task-oriented people. And by nature, people who tend to be detail-oriented, task-oriented people also tend not to be people. Like, we're good at the tech, we're bad sometimes with the people. And that's okay. That's part of that personality type that gets to be really good at web development work. And if you can do both, that's awesome. Most of us can't. So when we are dealing with an angry client and that's already pressing into an area where we already feel a little uncertain, it can be really easy to get defensive. So just remember not to get defensive, listen to the client, empathize, and give them a plan to roll forward. Now, if it's a situation where you didn't cause it and the client is being unreasonable, this is so very important. Stick to the facts. Look at your system. This is why it's important, not only for your own internal efficiency, but when you're dealing with clients, it's important to have a consistent system that you use for every client, every project, every time. Because if you have something like this and you've got a great contract that talks about your system, the client agrees to the process of building the site up front. When the client is being unreasonable and they want something that is outside the scope of work, or they want you to do something that is outside your regular system, what you've got to remember is system trumps drama. Always stick to the facts, the scope, the price, the process. And you just call the client back to the contract they signed and remind them, now this is the way we do things. This is the way we agreed to do things at the beginning. And the client is going to say, well, can't you just do that? Can't you just make it? Can't you? It's all these can't you just requests, right? But just remember, if the client is angry, if they're unhappy for one reason or another, don't be afraid to hold them accountable. You can do that very softly and professionally. System trumps drama. Just keep an even tone and refer them back to the facts of what they agreed to at the beginning of the project. And in that case, there's really no place for the client to go. And if they're angry, they're just going to be angry, but you've done your job of trying to keep the situation under control. Let's move on to the next area where a lot of times there are problems with clients, and that's where expectations differ. A lot of times we can get into a project and you're thinking one thing and the client is thinking another thing about where this project is going to go and what the results are going to be. Now, why does this happen? Well, unfortunately, a lot of times this is frequently our fault unless the client is just being unreasonable. We have differing expectations oftentimes because we didn't ask enough questions at the outset of the project. That's why it's so important to have a great checklist of questions, like I talked about yesterday in mastering the client consultation. If you have a consistent checklist of questions that is designed to uncover all of these hidden expectations that a client may bring into the project, this oftentimes never happens to begin with. And when it does happen, it's because we didn't follow our checklist or we didn't have a great checklist to begin with. By the way, a lot of my checklists have come from mistakes I've made with clients. So a lot of the questions on those lists are because I realized, I've made a mistake and the client had this expectation and I really ought to ask this question better the next time so this doesn't happen again. So learning the soft skill of asking great questions is something that can set you apart from other web developers. And if you will just start to do that and start to build your checklist, things get better. So having that consistent process for the initial client consultation, the intake meeting, like we talked about yesterday, so very important, but also frequent communication throughout the project. Now, this is so very, very important. Now, there's a friend of mine named Aaron Flynn in Colorado has this great concept called the 3-sentence email. I call it the Friday email. And every week on Friday afternoon, before I sign off for the week, I send an email to every active project, the manager on the client side of every project that we're working on. And it's a simple 3-sentence email. It's so simple. Anybody can do this. And this one simple habit can help to bridge all these communication gaps and keep expectations in line. It's a 3-sentence email. It's past, present, future. It goes like this. Mr. and Mrs. Client, this is what we worked on your project this week. That's the past. The present, this is where we are right now in terms of completing your project. The future, this is what we're going to be working on next week. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Now, this is a wonderful thing to do when you're stalled on content, for example. It's in that email that you can remind the client, look, we couldn't do anything on your project this week because we're still waiting on the content. And by the way, if, in a couple of weeks, your project it may become suspended because we've been waiting so long. That's another issue we'll talk about in just a little bit. But it's a great place to communicate those issues. And if you get into a habit of just every Friday, you can send those emails. They take like a minute a piece to do. That one little small habit I hear over and over again from people, that one small habit does more to up their game in communication than anything else. The other thing that's important to do is in your process, as you design your process, give the client opportunity to sign off at appropriate points. Now, what I mean by that is this. How many of you ever watch Who Wants to Be a Millionaire is back, right? Jimmy Kimmel's hosting this. And on the scale of money that you can win, there's always fallback point, right? Like you get over $1,000, and if you go above that and you miss a question, you fall back to $1,000, not to zero. And then I think the next one is 32,000 or something like that. But something like that you can incorporate into your system. So as you're building the site, what you don't want is right before you launch, the client says, oh, I don't like the way the site is designed. And you got to go back and redo a bunch of work. I've had to do that before, and it's no fun. And your system can help you deliver, and it can help deliver you from that situation. So what you do is you create a system that gives the client opportunities to sign off at key points. So when we get to content, the client signs off on content at the beginning. If we're going to redo content, then we have to go backwards, and that's going to cost a little more. After we do content, then we get a design approved. And we're either going to mock something up in a graphic program, or we're going to give them a couple of pages mocked up in a page builder or something like that. And they're going to sign off on that site design. And we don't build any more in the site until they sign off on the design, because we don't want to get into the development process and have the client want to make some design changes. That's going backwards. So it puts these waypoints into a project that the client signs off on and keeps you from going backwards. And it keeps expectations online. Like they help to reveal hidden expectations by having the client sign off. So differing expectations can be a big deal. Those are some things that can help you keep those out of the conversation. The next issue a lot of times you find is the issue of disappearing clients. Now, the reason this happens is, sometimes the client is just busy, right? They're busy and they're chasing the squeaky wheel in their own business. They're just trying to put out fires. And at this point, the website is not a priority. When they contacted you, it was a priority. But now, a week later, it's been replaced by one of their other top priorities. And it just happens with busy business owners. Now, let's talk about what to deal with this and how to prevent it. So first of all, especially if you're just getting started out, these kinds of clients that disappear can provide you some flexibility. If they let you take a project and maybe the client wants to press pause, great, you can work on some other stuff. No problem. However, that doesn't work really well later if you've got a consistent pipeline of work. That can really goof up your pipeline. But when you're first getting started, especially if you're not very busy, this is something you might be able to flex with. However, the problem with these disappearing clients is not that they disappear necessarily. It's when they reappear and say, oh, it's been 9 months. Why aren't you finished with our project yet? And the answer is, well, you never gave us the content for your site. You disappeared on us. So, if you want to disappear, okay, that creates some issues, but you can't just reappear and create chaos in our system. So how do we deal with that? What I do is over-communicate what I call the pipeline principle. This is, again, something you can use in that 3-sentence email strategy, the Friday email, and over-communicate. Look, we're waiting on your content. The clock is ticking here. In our contract, we have language that talks about suspended and abandoned projects. It's so important that you have a great contract for dealing with these sorts of situations where, in our contract, once the project has been on hold, we haven't heard from you in 30 days, your project is considered suspended and it's taken out of the queue. There is even a point where the project is considered abandoned and they lose the deposit they made on the project. But you got to make sure your contract covers client delays. And in the pipeline principle, you're just reminding the client that, look, we've got a lot of work that we're doing. We have a pipeline of work, and because we haven't heard from you, it's going to get pulled out and it'll be put back in the pipeline as soon as we get what we're waiting on from you, this approval or whatever. But it's not going to be immediate because you haven't responded in a timely fashion. And there's nice ways to communicate that, obviously. But when a client disappears and you're busy, it can be a real issue when they reappear with unrealistic demands. You got to make sure your contract covers that sort of situation. The next issue that a lot of times we'll face with clients is our own attitude. Now, I've heard rumors that sometimes we as WordPress business owners ourselves can have a bad attitude with clients. And it's just a rumor. I know maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you haven't. Could be that you're having a bad day, maybe a bad week. Could be that there's personal matters intruding on your work. That definitely happens. Could be that you're frustrated with one client that's driving you crazy and you accidentally take it out on another client who's really not that bad. But it's that bleed over from other frustrations with other clients that can oftentimes get into our additional client relationships. So how do you deal with that sort of situation? Sometimes we just need to step away from our desk. It's okay to do that. Take a day off. If you are working for yourself and you find yourself in the middle of the week and you're completely stressed out and you realize that for the rest of the day, you're just going to be stressed out and it's not going to be very helpful for anybody, you know what? Get up and go take a walk. Get up and just take the rest of the day off and do something you enjoy. It's okay. The work will be there tomorrow. It will oftentimes do you a lot better to take that time away, step away from your desk, than potentially sitting at your desk and irritating a bunch of other clients. It could be that maybe you need to let that call go to voicemail. Maybe you're having a bad day and you get a call from that particular client that just presses your buttons. And we all probably have one of those. And you see it come up on your caller ID and you just cringe, right? It's just, I don't want to talk to this person. Guess what? You don't have to. Let that call go to voicemail and just keep doing the work that you were doing before. And when you're in a better frame of mind, you can go and re-answer that question the client has. If you're angry or frustrated with a client, don't ever reply to the email. Just don't do it. The angry email or the frustrated email or the snarky email may be the best email that you never should have sent. It is, if you are really good at wording passive-aggressive emails, don't send those. Just don't hit the send if you're angry. Don't hit send if there's a drop of snarkiness to the email. It's just not going to help you in the long run. And by the way, don't talk badly about your clients to other people, because number one, you never know who's listening. And also, that tends to color your interaction with that client in the future. As you're telling stories about how bad this client is, we tend to over exaggerate some of those stories just a little bit even. And that starts to create a false narrative about that client in our own mind. And it becomes more and more difficult to work with that particular client. It's something I've learned. So just be aware of that. Keep a balanced view of your client and yourself. Clients are people too. They have bad days too. And so a lot of times we just need to extend some grace to our clients, especially during this time of COVID-19 when everybody's just a little stressed. Give clients some grace. And just remember, we get to do what we love to do because of clients. And, yes, some clients can be very difficult to work with, but they let us do what we love to do. And so important to keep our attitudes in check as we're doing our work. The next problem that we can deal with is the problem of too much work. You may say that doesn't sound like a problem to me. It can definitely be a problem. If you've got too much work, it's a huge issue. It happens because you're awesome, but you can't say no. Like every project that comes in, maybe you're afraid to take on the project. You're afraid not to take on a project, and so you get stressed or delayed on other work. And that happens. And this is really a problem. When there's too much work, the money may be nice, but it starts to build up, and it really starts to have work bleed over into other areas of life, and it can become very stressful. So maybe it's time to raise your prices. I'm famous for telling people you need to raise your prices. I have that conversation with people all the time. I have met very few people at WordCamps or other places who are charging too much for the work they do for clients. Almost always, it is the other way around. Have you raised your prices recently? You ought to be on at least an annual price increase of 5 to 10%. You just ought to always be raising your prices. And it's simple to do. By the way, there's a simple 3-step process for raising your price on the next proposal that you send. You simply erase the price that you were going to charge. Step 2, add some money to it and hit send. I promise you, if you bump up that price a few $100s, it's not going to affect the client accepting that proposal. It just never does. So gradually raise your prices. That's a good thing. It can help you deal with this too much work issue. Don't be afraid also to set a future start date. Scarcity can be a strong influencer. One of the first things out of my mouth as I work with clients is, look, we stay 4 to 6 weeks booked out. That's typical runway for us. 4 to 6 weeks. If you sign a contract with us today, it's going to be usually 4 weeks before we can actually start the work. I used to be afraid to tell clients that. And so if the client wanted to give me money to start the project, well, I would just work late at night until I got that done. And that created all kinds of problems family-wise. So, and it wasn't, what I realized was that it didn't put the clients off. Matter of fact, it actually works into my content first approach. So I give them the content tools immediately. I let them work on their content while I'm working on my pipeline of work. And usually about 4 weeks later, the client's about finished with their content, and we can start to work on their project when they're ready with the content. So don't be afraid to push the project out. It's okay. Just give them those content tools to work with while they wait. And I got to move things along here for sake of time. Scope creep. This is something everybody deals with. The client gets new ideas, right? They see something that they like on some other site. And it usually happens because the purpose of the project is not well defined. That's why it's important to ask that question early on, maybe in that first intake meeting with the client. What are we trying to do here? What's the purpose of this site? Who's the audience? What are we building for? A lot of times that can help to narrow down scope creep. But honestly, you may not want to remove scope creep. Scope creep can mean money creep, right? The problem with scope creep is when you have scope creep without price creep that corresponds to it. So when you increase your price with scope, it's a great way to make more money. So if the client wants more in the project, then the price ought to correspond at the same rate. Now, we also want to be clear to define the purpose and the audience of the site up front. Look, I understand you want a slider on the homepage, but if we're really trying to accomplish this purpose with your audience, that's not the best way to do it. And that's a good way to talk through those sorts of issues with the client. You can head off scope creep by asking great questions at the beginning and having a clear scope of work in your proposal. I also talk through scope creep with the client. And one of the things that I've started to do, a friend of mine named Beth Livingston has the complete project management roadmap for WordPress, and she deals with scope creep quite a bit. And she suggests adding a change budget to the website. It's a beautiful thing that I've started adding to all my projects in the last year. It's about a 20% additional line item in addition to the proposed scope of work cost. And the client sees that, and we just say, look, sometimes you get new ideas, and it's great. This is a change budget that we're going to add to the project, and it doesn't get spent unless you approve the change. And that way, as you get into the project, they want to add something else. There's a little bucket of pre-approved money, and they can elect to spend more money on that scope. It just positions you for scope creep better. It's a really great way to do it. But scope creep can mean more money, but scope creep without dollar creep is a bad deal.
Nathan, we have a little bit less than 15 minutes.
Yes,
Let you know.
we'll wrap up here in just a second. We'll take time for questions. Thanks. So, time wasters. You ever have a client that wastes your time? Talked about that a little bit yesterday. This can happen a lot of times because the client is stream of consciousness. They just kind of think they're asking lots of questions. They're naturally inquisitive. Maybe they're a control freak and they love to ask a million questions and waste your time. Now, the reason this happens is that, honestly, we allow the client to monopolize our time. I realized early on that I was getting frustrated with clients because I hated that they were kind of in control of how I spent my time during the day. And what I learned was this was happening because I was letting them do it. A lot of times we've trained our clients to waste our time, and we need to untrain them. So here's an example of that. You're sitting at your desk, you've got your email open, and you're working on a project. And boom, a ding, an email comes in, right? And you stop what you're doing on your project, you look over at your second monitor of the email, and you hack out a quick response and you hit send because the client wanted the answer to a question. Now, what we forget is that, when you respond to a client immediately like that, you may pat yourself on the back for great customer service, but what you've actually done is trained your client that they can email you at any point of the day or even night if you have really bad productivity habits. They can email you anytime and expect an immediate response. And that's just not sustainable, especially as you grow. So when clients call me on the phone, they rarely ever get me. It goes to voicemail. I return calls twice a day. If they email me, they never get an immediate response. I usually do emails twice a day because I'm doing other things. I block my time for productivity. So when you do that, it begins to train those clients that are stream of consciousness thinkers and they're sending you 100 emails to start to maybe put all those questions into one email, get those questions answered all at once. It also shows them they're not going to get an immediate response, and the world doesn't come to an end that way either. So don't train your clients to expect that immediate response. One of the worst things you can do is if you're sitting in your living room watching television at 10 o'clock at night and a client sends you a quick email. A lot of times we want to respond to that email and show it was great customer service, but then you've trained your clients. They can email you at 10 o'clock at night and expect a response. It's just not a great situation. I actually use an email app that allows me to delay sending. So if I want to respond to an email at 10 o'clock at night because I'm sitting there doing nothing, I can do that, but I'm going to delay the send until 8 o'clock the next morning. So there's ways around that. If you have a client that habitually wastes your time, schedule an appointment with them rather than responding to their whims, just calls, emails, whatever. I plan for those clients that ask 100 questions and the time goes on and on. I will plan a window for the call. We can talk between 1 and 2 p.m. this afternoon, and I will actually schedule another call at 2 o'clock. If it's not with another client, it'll be with my wife. And at 1:58, I'm like, I got it in the call. I have another call at 2 o'clock. So I can say we have a hard stop on this time. So people waste our time because we let them. We are in control of our time. And so it's important not to make ourselves perpetually available and start to hem that time in. Last one here I want to talk about is the hero syndrome. And this is a term that I've come up with, and see if this resonates with you. Hero syndrome is when you feel a need to come to the rescue of problem clients to the detriment of everything else in your life. It's an unhealthy need to be liked by the client or to fix the client. And for some of you listening, you're like, that's not me at all. And that's okay. But there's some of you who are listening and you're like, yes, that's me. I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, I feel like I have to be liked by the client. I can't sleep well at night unless the client likes me. I feel like I've got to fix all the client's problems. And that's where like my self-worth comes from. And I lived with this for years and years. And we have to recognize it for what it is. And it's really a kind of codependency because we'll tend to allow ourselves to be mistreated by clients because it makes us feel needed or important. Like we want to be in this relationship with the client no matter how much it costs us in the other areas of our life. And it's a really unhealthy way to have business. It's a really unhealthy way to live. And it comes from a low view of ourselves. And it can be fed by imposter syndrome. And so the way to deal with hero syndrome, and by the way, I do a whole talk on this. If you go to WordPress TV, it was the keynote for WordCamp Denver 2019. I talked about hero syndrome and some other things. You can look that up. I don't have a lot of time to get into it today. This is really an issue I know that affects a lot of folks. We have to do some work on ourselves. Therapy is a good thing to help us to build our self-image because this issue is probably not just affecting our business. See, it's good to be helpful, but if our self-worth lies in how other people view us, then we're setting ourselves up to be abused by clients. People will take advantage of us if we let them. And I'm ashamed to say that in the early days of my business, I would work late at night. I would work on weekends. I would a lot of times ignore my family just to please the client. And in many cases, the client could never be pleased. So even though you're running a service business, that doesn't mean being a doormat. So if you have a tendency toward this, you need strong boundaries around your business. You need to be accountable to somebody. But whatever you do, don't try to fix the client. You build websites. That's out of the scope of work. So anyway, there's a lot more to be said about hero syndrome, and you can hear that again on that keynote on WordPress.tv, the keynote for Denver. Just search for my name, Nathan Ingram, and it'll pop up as one of the videos there, WordCamp Denver 2019. So those are the 9 common problems. I know I kind of ran through a lot of these quickly. You can download the slides and resources, nathaningram.com/WordCampKent. And I think we have some time for Q&A.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Nathan. There were so many great comments. Everyone was saying, that some of the stuff was mind blowing to them. So hopefully it'll change the way that they do their business. But one of the first questions we had was in your first points about finding a writer to work with. And we actually had, I think, a writer ask, well, how do I find a good developer to work with? And then someone else was like, yeah, how do I find a reputable writer? So how do you go about finding those kinds of professionals that you want to partner with?
Sure, absolutely. So it's the same way people usually find me, which is referrals, right? And looking in your local area, it depends on, do you need somebody local? For me in my business, it's a lot of FaceTime. That's one of the things that sets my business apart. Is I love to be the one throat to choke when it comes to a client's website. And so I'm going to be a local person. We're going to sit across the table from the client and so forth. So for me, it's important to have a local writer that can actually meet with the client face to face. And I found a lot of my couple of writers I found in our local WordPress meetup on our WordCamp team. I found some others, in some other organizations that I've worked with. Talk to other web developers in your area. Are they using writers? A lot of times you can find a person who's a great blogger in your area, maybe through your local WordCamp or WordPress meetup, and they'll be a great source for a writer for you. You can also look at the traditional places like Upwork for writers if location isn't an issue.
Okay, perfect. Hopefully that helps the couple questions we had. Lori had a few questions, and her first one was a really good one. You mentioned the Friday emails, and then this issue of projects being stalled because the client isn't getting back to you or isn't taking the next step. How long do you go sending those Friday emails? Do you still contact them after the project is suspended? I mean, if it goes on for years, is there another point where you reach out to them?
So when the project is suspended, I'll continue to contact the client because there is a point, and it may not be every week, but there is a point in our contract and process where the project gets abandoned, meaning they've lost their deposit. We're just, the project is over because the client has basically disappeared on the project. So I will usually contact the client a few times between when the project is suspended and when it's abandoned, but not necessarily every week.
Okay, gotcha. And then her other question is when you talked about price increases. So for your current clients, do you notify them of the price increases?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. And so In WordPress care plans, for example, there's an small annual price increase, and that just happens usually in February. But we let them know, we don't get approval for it. It's just the price is going up. Every other, your cell phone provider doesn't ask your permission if your prices are going to go up.
Right.
But for projects, that's just the next proposal we write. The price goes up.
Gotcha. And this is kind of a timely question, and you touched on it a little bit, but there, have been some comments about right now, in terms of having enough work, there's been some instances of people's clients closing permanently, or, I'm sure people are seeing more and more stalls out there. So how do you handle those kinds of situations if you've come across them, or what advice do you have for that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And so I've been fortunate that none of the clients that I work with are in industries that have been, destroyed by the situation that we're in now. So I'm grateful for that, but I know that a lot of people are, and so I always default to empathy with the client, right? Grace and empathy. So how can I help? So one of the things I did, for example, when the COVID-19 thing started to happen, was I opened up my calendar. Look, I'm doing free half-hour consultations with all of my clients that are on a care plan. How can we help? What are some digital strategies we can put in place? What are the things we can do? I'm going to give as much as I can to these clients that we're already serving. If if you're in a situation where the client contacts you and says, "Look, I can't. We just don't have the revenue coming in to continue this monthly WordPress management or whatever it is that you have with them." I might we'll look at it and say, all right, let's just press pause this month and see, and let's talk again in 30 days and see how things are. I'm usually going to pause a month before I'm going to do a discount. I think discounting puts the client into a psychology that's difficult to recover from, but pausing a payment may be a good thing.
Great. I know. I mean, I think generosity is going a long way right now. Any extra bit of communication or anything, I'm sure clients really appreciate. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Shanta asked, how do you get over the hump when you find you don't know a particular part of a business, or you feel like you're running into imposter syndrome?
You get over the hump when you don't feel like you understand a part of your business, I guess. Yeah, gosh. So that's where it's the best thing about WordPress is not the software, it's the community. And so finding community with other people who do what you do is so important. Now, what I can tell you is this: after hundreds of conversations with people and having run my business for 25 years, I can tell you there are no unique problems. If you think you're the only one that has whatever particular problem is occupying your headspace right now, like I'm the only one that struggles with bad clients, I'm the only one that doesn't have my financial ducks in a row, I'm the only one that you fill in the blank. You're not. I promise you're not. Every business owner struggles or has struggled with these things. And the wonderful thing about the WordPress community is business owners tend to be very open about helping others. And so, I certainly am. It's why I go to WordCamps. I try to help people blow up the obstacles that we all face in, trying to grow. So having community, or, one of the best things I ever did was hire a business coach for my own business and, help really overcome some of those obstacles. So imposter syndrome is normal, and it never goes away, by the way. It only, it pops up in different areas. And so whoever you are, if you're struggling with imposter syndrome, very normal.
Thank you. I appreciate the transparency. And I mean, again, thank you for answering everyone's questions. I think we have time for one more. I'm looking for that. Okay. A question about productivity blocks. How long do you usually schedule those? Is like 3 hours, longer than that? Is there an ideal time you found to kind of work through things?
Yes. So because what I've learned in my world is if it's not simple, it's not repeatable, right? If whatever productivity tools or process you use is not simple, then you're not going to be able to sustain it. So I do it very simply. There's 5 days in a week. Every day has 2 parts, morning and afternoon, and I block that time. So my mornings I'm doing something, my afternoons are doing something. Now, there's also a wonderful book called When by Daniel Pink that is the science of I forget what he says. Shoot, it's all about figuring out what is the best kind of work you should be doing at a certain type of day based on your chronotype. Like you may be best to do detail work in the morning, others may be best to do it in the late afternoon. It just depends. So learning when you do certain kinds of tasks the best is so important. Like never answer email first thing in the morning. Like for a lot of people, that's your gold time. That's like your most productive time. Don't spend it doing knucklehead email responses. Spend that on working on projects and being creative and doing something that matters, and save the routine email responses for mid-afternoon when most of us are usually kind of blah in the tank.
All right. Well, thank you, Nathan, again for all of your insights, your energy today. Everyone loved it. He has his contact information there. So we will see you around. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.